Welcome to the GovDiscovery AI podcast with Mike Shanley, your source for actionable insight into government markets and foreign policy. GovDiscovery AI leverages a decade of experience winning federal funding to deliver intel to sales, proposal, and capture teams working in defense and civilian markets. Now here's your host, Mike Shanley.
Welcome to the GovDiscovery AI podcast. I'm your host, Mike Shanley. Today we have Chris Watson, Vice President at Premise Data, here to talk about AI, government, and procurement. Chris, always great to see you. Always great to get your insight on the government funding market. And thanks a lot for being on the podcast today.
Great to see you too, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Well, let's get right into it, Chris. What are the procurement bottlenecks to AI adoption by government?
Sure. So I think, maybe I'll start with the obvious ones, which are probably the most well-known, which is like when people first think about like, what AI tools do I want to use as somebody who works in government, they go to chatbots like ChatGPT or Gemini for Google, right? And I think, those are bottlenecks are largely solved in that, those big providers are now capable of running their models on, government approved clouds, be that in either a, sensitive but unclassified or a classified environment. They've largely worked out deals with various government agencies about, exactly how the data can be used, i.e. they can't further train their models on it. But I think a lot of people still worry about those, even though, the chief information officers and chief data officers across our various, government agencies has solved a lot of these problems and have partnered with, vendors to bring them in. But I think that is like the low-hanging fruit here. Like, I think, when we really talk about AI's potential to transform how our government operates, we're often talking about applications outside of just talking to a chatbot, right? And that means, in my opinion, often starting to replace or augment the types of services that the government provides or buys using AI. And that's where I think it gets a lot trickier. So to take just sort of like a benign example, like translation services. There are AI models now that will do translation for you, and that will do it just as well or almost just as well as a human translator. But, those are models that are typically provided by startups. They're venture funded. They want to be able to charge a commercial price for that. And the government, buys translation services under a translation services NAICS code, not a software publisher NAICS code. If you don't know what a NAICS code is, it's the North America Industry Classification System. Government has to decide when they're going to buy something, what type of procurement it's going to be, right? So you immediately run into this like seemingly kind of stupid, but actually kind of like game breaking problem where, a AI company that's capable of providing, or replacing that service with a product is not going to want to bid because they can't give you, a time and materials budget with different translator rates in it. And they're not going to do deliverable based, payment, like pay me for each document you translated. They want to charge you a monthly subscription. They want to charge you under a consumption based model. And this applies for a whole host of use cases. I think anytime you are trying to replace something a human does with a product, you're going to run into an issue where the government is used to buying things under a cost reimbursement basis using labor rates, and you have a square peg round hole problem when you try to replace that with a product.
How widely understood is this issue? And maybe a separate question that is, how widely understood are solutions to the issue within government, with the industry customers?
I think those are both good questions. So one, I do not think it is very widely understood on the part of either the tech companies or the government. So I think the end users of these products when they're starting to replace services is usually not like a CIO's office, right? It's like some sort of a, technical office or program office, right? And so they tend to think when I want to buy something, I write up a scope of work and I send it off to a procurement team and they run a competitive procurement and do it. But they're the ones that are, doing the market research at the early stage that are talking to these companies. And then a company says like, here's our price list. They say, I can't talk about pricing. I'm not allowed to do that. And so they never even get to have the conversation. And then I think these deals often fall apart. Premise is a company that is effectively replacing market research services with a product. Like, this is a problem I've been working on for 9 years. And I think the government, particularly the actual end users and the people who are doing the evaluations, don't understand that problem. But on the flip side, when I joined Premise, like, we'll have people at a leadership level who, they have direction from our investors and from our board. Like, this is a software as a service product, and we're not going to cave and do, professional service-based contracting. And they don't understand why the government doesn't understand, right? And it's a problem that I think is kind of unique to these applications, because if this were cloud, if this were cybersecurity, the buyers are people in government who get it already. They've already, shifted a bunch of their loads from on-premise servers to the cloud. They learned these lessons back when Amazon Web Services and Azure and GCP were rolled out. So they get it, but they're not necessarily involved or the real, kind of like end user or buyer for these new applications. And so the conversations kind of break down.
Following on to that, there's industry-wide talk about FAR reforms. What are your hopes for what the FAR reforms will deliver? Are you optimistic that some of these issues will be addressed? I mean, really what we're talking about here is delivering greater government efficiency and adjusting these procurement bottlenecks to allow for that greater efficiency to be delivered to the government for their end mission. What's your take right now on where the FAR reform, the federal acquisition procurement reform is at?
Yeah. So I think I am overall optimistic about FAR reform's ability to address some of these issues. And I think, closely related to that, perhaps the centralization of a lot of government buying, taking some of that outside of different government agencies and bringing it all together in one place is probably likely to result in people running procurements who understand these issues a little bit better. But I think that there's a separate issue that's not going to be addressed by the FAR reform, and that's the norms around this. Like, I have always thought that the biggest issue in, sort of inhibiting government adoption with new technology is the fear that if government employees talk to industry, they will go to procurement jail. The truth is, there is nothing illegal about, a government employee meeting with a commercial provider of software or AI products or whatever, and going into great detail about what their products cost, how they need to be bought in order for that to work. But there is, I think, a fear, particularly amongst the agencies that are the most heavily audited. So in some ways, I think the Defense Department gets a little bit of a break here compared to other government agencies. There's a fear that if they have those conversations, that they're going to get in trouble in some way. At the same time, nobody knows anyone that's like actually gone to procurement jail. People who've actually defrauded the government or stolen have, of course, gone to jail. But just having a conversation with a vendor, it's okay. So I think it's really incumbent on leadership to try to change some of those norms and be telling, rank and file, go out and be talking about new solutions. And I have seen some of that, right? So I want to be optimistic. I had some great meetings at the State Department with folks that were specifically instructed to look at new technologies that might solve some of their issues with a focus on AI. So that's helping, but I think it can't just be FAR reform. It's got to be norms as well.
Now, getting within AI, specifically to agentic AI, and we can probably have a separate conversation about what is an AI agent? How do you actually even define that? Does this conversation apply as we've had it to agentic AI, or do you see additional issues or opportunities coming out in future evolutions of AI?
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about agentic AI, and I'm not going to get into the discussion of what is and isn't. I'm not sure that I, have a firm stance on it anyway. But I actually think there's some unique opportunities, right? Like, we have a government that is used to buying people and services. Especially, once you move outside of the large, capital expenditures of the Defense Department, planes, ships, right? If that's what they're used to, maybe we amend the FAR or procurement guidance at an agency level to allow people to buy AI agents and get a rate just like they would for a person. And they can tell bidders, give me your rates for these positions, give me your rates for your AI agents. And then, maybe there would be less retraining involved of contracting officers. Like, I don't want to presuppose that the entire way that the U.S. government does procurements needs to be torn up because of, a major tech tech invention, right? There might be ways, particularly if high level and important conversations are held with industry, that are maybe a little cute, but also work, right? So yeah, I sort of look forward to the day when there's a T&M contract out there that includes both people and AI
No,
agents, right?
exactly. I think that's exactly what I'm thinking. On your GSA schedule, you have 12 different AI agents, and they all have hourly rates for, and they're running 24 hours a day. Maybe they're not limited to 8-hour days. So yeah, I think that's very interesting, especially with the widely discussed GSA consolidation of procurement. Let's talk a little bit more specifically about the defense market then, where our business development and market intel tools are focused. SpaceX, Palantir, Anduril, we've seen them make the jump from Silicon Valley and then from piloting to scaling and becoming established partners in the defense market. Are these trends of what's to come? And I'd throw premise data into that category as well. Are these trends of what's to come, or are these outliers? And I know we talked about right in our prep, Chris, was about whether winning a DARPA grant, does that mean you have product market fit for the Department of Defense? Or does that mean someone just liked your R&D idea or your concept note and is willing to give you a little bit of funding to see where that goes? So big question there, Chris. I'll let you take that where you want.
Yeah, and maybe I'll do two answers to that since you kind of posed it in two really great directions. So I think this is probably a trend of what's to come and not an outlier, but the proof is going to be in the pudding. So let me get into that. So right now, if you look at jobs in Washington, D.C. for account executive, enterprise account manager, et cetera, you will find dozens of venture-funded tech companies who found product market fit in the private sector, raised a large growth funding round, and are building out a sales team focused on the government. For some applications, that might be exclusively defense. For some, it might be both defense and federal civilian. So people are going to try it. They have seen the success of, I think, really it started with SpaceX moving from commercial rocketry to also selling to NASA. But I think closely followed by, and in many ways more importantly, Palantir, being able to go from just doing small pilots to getting actual government programs of record. But you will see tons of other organizations try it, and they should, right? The government has a need for many of these products that were originally created to address a primarily private sector requirement. And there's no reason that our government shouldn't be able to buy and use the best new products out there. I think the reason I say the verdict is still out is that, many companies who have been trying this over the last few years have found that there is ample money available for pilots. You get DARPA funding, you get a small business innovation research grant, you started with the Air Force Ventures program, and those companies said, look, I got $3 million, I got a government buyer, they're happy with this product. I want to raise more money off it and expand it. And then what they found was that when they needed to make that jump from innovation funding to a proper program of record, that's a 5-year contract, that is fully funded, that those RFPs don't get created. And instead, they have to go the route of doing continuous unfunded requests at the end of the fiscal year, or finding ways to get a government buyer who has a contract vehicle with an existing large prime to plug money into that and then have the prime go buy them. And that sale has to be redone every single year. It changes who the prime is every time the prime contract is negotiated. And so the churn rates, or the renewal rates is sort of the inverse of that, are lower than these software and AI companies are used to seeing in the private sector, and they get frustrated by that. And I mean, this problem is so bad that it led Andreessen Horowitz, a really prominent venture firm, to roll out entire marketing campaign, speakers, podcast, just trying to say government needs to fix this issue, right? So I think this is well known, but it did not get fixed before large language models came out. And now there's an entire crop of companies that are going to run into the same problem.
So on the tech side, following up on that, how does designing the tech or selling the tech to private sector differ from selling it to government? In the Silicon Valley speak, the common phrase is move fast and break things. Well, in the public sector, in many cases, the stakes are just much higher than my login doesn't work. I need to get the password reset, or this UI isn't compatible with Safari or with Firefox. Or how do you frame that conversation in terms of that difference of selling tech to government versus private sector?
Yeah, I think similar to your first question, there's some kind of obvious differences and there's some less obvious ones. So I think the obvious ones are like, obviously we're, often dealing with either classified or, sensitive information. We might be dealing with personal identifiable information about American citizens. And so, there's all these additional controls. And of course, you need to get FedRAMP approval and be working with a FedRAMP approved cloud provider. So, there's all these things that are kind of like known knowns on this, right? That inhibit that. But I think a less appreciated one is, let's say I'm a private sector company and I've got a, customer service related chatbot that I'm going to roll out and use as a way to augment or replace my call center. It's not going to be a one-to-one replacement for a call center. CEO of Databricks, for example, recently was just speaking and saying it's actually really hard to 100% automate how we used to do something with AI. And so instead, the buyers, the private sector company that's buying that product will have to change internal processes, staffing, what they offer their customers around that technology if they fully want to embrace it. But I think because government is so used to custom building everything to be exactly what they want, they've traditionally been kind of hesitant to say, okay, this will save us 90% of what we're spending here, but we'll have to change some of our processes to work with this product. They'll be like, nah. And I just think that's probably not going to fly anymore. I think particularly, in an environment where some government agencies are seeing spending cuts, but then in others in the Department of Defense space, it might not be so much about the funding cuts. It might be more about the change of mission, right? And in particular, with a focus on great power competition and countering China, I think that so much of how that's done is sort of done in the information space and on top of the physical world. And that's going to involve embrace of new products of technologies. And so the Defense Department's going to have to maybe change some of how they do information operations, for example, to be able to then embrace and use those products.
We've touched a little bit on this difference of between the DoD procurement market and the federal civilian procurement market. Could you talk a little bit, and then my next question will be for new entrants to the market, which you also touched on. Maybe let's start with DoD versus civilian, again, with our focus being really just on the defense side. So very interested to get your insight on that for our clients. What is that difference, and what are the similarities to selling to both civilian and defense markets?
Yeah. So I think the first advice I would have is to not fool yourself and say, government has a lot of money, of course we can get it. And then don't say, just because you have a pilot that you necessarily have product market fit. I think that's one of the most dangerous things is like, you have to think the government buyer who has a pot of innovation money, their job is to spend the pot of innovation money. Their job isn't necessarily to solve, one specific problem. And in particular, they don't have to then, at scale, stop paying for one thing to buy that. So they don't have to make that trade-off. But the actual end users who are ultimately going to be responsible for, whatever, using your product or, buying your service, they have to make those decisions. So just be realistic. I think the second is invest early on in what I would call channel partnerships, which is to say, we're not going to move to a world where government is buying all of these technologies and using them directly overnight. You're going to need partners. Secretary Hegspeth has, made some announcements about how the Department of Defense is no longer going to buy products from a systems integrator or a reseller unless they can, demonstrate and get approval at a very senior level that there's a good reason to do so. But that said, I don't think that means that suddenly you don't need a strong relationship with Leidos or Booz Allen Hamilton or GDIT. I think that there's a lot of solutioning work that's going to be required to make these products work really well for government. And of course, there's the contract vehicles, right? And this is something, Premise comes out of this kind of like decade ago crop of companies that started commercial and built a public sector business. But this new crop of AI companies, when they're hiring sales reps, they're hiring partnership managers too. So I do think a lot of the new entrants are understanding this, and they're separating out the job of finding partners to help them go to market from doing actual sales, and that will probably help.
And that's what we're seeing, at least in the last few months, is the biggest demand on the market intel for the business development teams from our side is on that solutioning. But how can you align your solutioning with the priorities of the new administration, in some cases the evolving or developing priorities of the new administration? And what we aim to get to always is, what is it the administration is looking for? If it's the Department of Defense, what are all those market signals? And then for whatever that specific use case product that we're talking about here, where does that fit into their priorities? And what are those talking points for, as you said, those conversations with government or those conversations with the primes, and how you can share with them, hey, your boss was on the Hill last week talking about this, this, and this. Here's how we can help you deliver on what she was looking for. So with that, I'd love to get a story from you, Chris. Does any example come to mind of not what's going to happen in the future, but where is AI adoption? Where has it worked? Where do you see it working? Happy to hear an example from Premise Data, or if it's with another company too. But are you seeing examples where this is working, or is it still a little bit too early and we're just going to be talking about pilot projects? There's really no scaled AI solutions quite yet.
Yeah, no, I think there are examples of where this is working. I think, to start at kind of a high level, I think anybody following the war between Russia and Ukraine has seen the proof that like smaller, theoretically less well-equipped militaries in this case, Ukraine, have been able to fight, really asymmetrically against Russia quite effectively using both, innovative hardware in terms of the different types of drones that they've invented and they're using, but are you better than using AI to deploy it? And I think between that and the need to not fall behind China when it comes to AI development, that in the defense space, we are definitely starting to see some success. I think that, in the use case of Premise, where, a lot of our, if you don't know what we do, it's a market research platform that uses a combination of kind of online panel surveys and gig work to make it possible to collect data all across the world without actually needing to be there, and to be able to do that in a way that's fully digital. So we're much more involved in the public sector space in the like opinion polling perspective, either, for global public affairs related use cases, for communicating to the public about how we're partnering with the Filipino military and training them, like those types of things. And we've definitely seen a lot of adoption of that in the sort of public affairs, kind of information operations space. But I think, to get back to an earlier point, these are often still decisions that are getting made by, one commander during his or her tour, using, an unfunded request, or UFR, if you're familiar with that, or using money they have for something else and plugging it into an existing contract. And I have seen less of the sort of like DoD or other government agency-wide rollouts, again, with the big exceptions being, I think, Palantir and then SpaceX, of course, at both NASA and the Air Force.
Yeah, that's the big thing we've seen for those ad hoc, we'll say, conversations. It's delivering to our clients the talking points for those. But Chris, I'll say I've always been very interested in Premise Data. I was introduced to them years ago when you started working there. I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you all do, and if you could share some case studies on how that data is collected and why that data is useful to the government.
Sure. Yeah. So, like I started to say, Premise is basically like Uber, but for data collection, right? So we have an app. We have a little over 9 million people on it globally, and they get paid to either answer surveys or do kind of observational data collection, which we taking pictures, mapping places, et cetera, in the communities where they live. And the problem that we've been trying to solve with this product, and then, the AI platform that sits on top of it that makes it possible for our customers to use it themselves, is really one of speed, right? Like, in the past, I think the limitations on how this type of research was done made it very difficult to use if your use case was something that needed to be highly actionable and fast, right? So, you of course saw this for, monitoring and evaluation of U.S., foreign assistance for training the Filipino military. Of course, they collect survey data on that, but that didn't necessarily need to be done in 15 days or something, right? And so, what we've sought to do is enable, data-driven decision making for use cases where that data was often impossible to collect in a really rapid time frame, or the scale of the data that was required was such that it just didn't make sense to do until you could tap into local community members. So, another example of that is like both our military and federal civilian agencies conduct tons of operations across the globe in countries with really poor maps. Right. And it's important to build those maps for everything from, evacuation of non-combatants, which the military is responsible for. How do we get folks from the embassy out? Route reconnaissance, everything that's tied to those types of operations, through delivering a disaster response after an earthquake or a hurricane. Right. And so, we've provided a ton of that, data collection for improving maps at both the federal civilian and DoD side. And, one of the reasons that I've become so passionate about these kind of like curious procurement problems is that we run into this all the time, right? Like, typically, if you wanted to commission opinion polling, there's an opinion polling NICE code for that. And we're saying, well, like, here, just take our product and do it yourself. It'll cost 10% of the old costs and it'll take you a few days. And they're like, well, that sounds really great, but like, I don't think I can buy software. So, in our particular use case, we run into these issues with the Paperwork Reduction Act, which was never designed to prohibit our government from collecting opinion data in these countries, but still does. And so you start to learn how all of these little rules that you didn't think of are like the thing that's keeping you from going from, not necessarily 0 to 1, but 1 to 100.
And I think the use case I've always found is really interesting for your team is the early warning system. If it's for natural disasters or for conflict, is looking at increase or really decrease of activity on the street, or early, changes in migration across a bridge or across a road. So, all right, well, Chris, as we're wrapping up here, what's the so what you'd like to leave our audience with from our conversation today?
Yeah, I think the so what is that there are going to be seemingly kind of innocuous things that end up being huge barriers to government adoption of AI, to tech companies selling, AI products into government, and to the channel partners and prime contractors that they tend to work with. And that if you get blindsided by those, you might find that you made serious investments in a space that aren't going to pay off. Or, on the flip side, I think the government will find that it's missing out on a lot of the new best-in-class products and categories if it doesn't internally find ways to solve these issues.
Great. Well, Chris, lastly, how can our audience connect with you and connect with Premise Data if they want to work with you?
Yeah, I think the best way to connect with me personally is on LinkedIn. I think we'll drop my LinkedIn profile in the show notes. Best way to connect with Premise is on our website. There's a get in touch button. If you just want to talk, if you want to get a demo, you can find ways to get in touch with us there, or you can send me a message on LinkedIn and I'll get you sorted.
All right. Well, hey, Chris, thanks for taking some time out of your day to share some insight on AI and government. Really appreciate it, and look forward to staying in touch as this conversation surely continues to evolve.
Likewise. Thanks, Mike, and thanks for everything you're doing here.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too.
Thank you for tuning in to the GovDiscovery AI podcast with Mike Shanley. GovDiscovery AI leverages our team's decade of experience winning federal funding to deliver federal growth intel to sales, proposal, and capture teams working in defense and civilian markets. Each market intel report is delivered by federal growth experts leveraging our proprietary deep data discovery process. If you enjoyed today's show, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and connect with GovDiscovery AI and Mike Shanley on LinkedIn, or learn more at govdiscoveryai.com.